Well, good morning and good evening, everybody. We are very honored today to have Jeremy Rifkin today to give us the lecture on his new book. And also we are equally honored to have Professor Mika and Professor Buma Liang to give us their comments and from their perspectives. So I'll just give a very brief introduction of the speaker. Jeremy Rifkin, I guess, is a speaker without any necessary need to do any introduction. He's so famous in China and also, of course, in other places of the world. And he has published so many books and very famous ones, including the Third Industrial Revolution, the Zero Marginal Cost Society, and the Green New Deal. His books has been translated into more than 35 languages. Rifkin is also the principal architect of the European Union's and also China's economic plans for transitioning into the Third Industrial Revolution to address climate change, and has also served as an advisor to the Senate Majority Leader Charles Schumer on the U.S. infrastructure plan. And in China, Prime Minister Li Keqiang said he was Jeremy's fan. After reading his book. And Jeremy is listed among the top 10 most influential economic thinkers in the Huffington Post global survey of the world's most influential voices. Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Jeremy. Now you can start the lecture. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me and for spending some time with me. It's much appreciated. Well, let me start on a bit of a somber note. The viruses are going to keep coming. We are going to have more pandemics. And the reason is, when my dad was born in 1908, 85% of this planet was still wilderness, no human development, all wild. Today, only 23% of the entire planet is still wilderness. And in 50 years from now, there may be nothing left of the wilderness. So the viruses are migrating. They are climate migrants, and they're attaching themselves to animals, and they're moving closer and closer to our species, huddled in urban masses. If that were not enough, we are now in real-time climate change. When I began working on the issue of fossil fuels and climate in 1973, 50 years ago, we still thought we were in a fairly benign climate. Today, no longer. We are experiencing, and I think we need to explain, not to this group, but we need to explain to the public why we're getting the violent weather. It's all about the hydrosphere. There are four main spheres that animate life on Earth: the hydrosphere, the waters; the lithosphere, the soil, the plants, the animals; the atmosphere, the oxygen; and the biosphere, which encompasses them. Those spheres maintain life, but the waters are the crucial mover. And what's happened now is we've emitted so many global warming gases into the atmosphere that they're preventing the sun's heat from getting back off the Earth. So for every 1 degree Celsius that the temperature goes up because of global warming gases in the atmosphere is actually sucking up 7% more precipitation from the ground. The heat's forcing the precipitation into the clouds, more concentrated precipitation, and more violent water events. This will be familiar to everyone in the world. And that is blockbuster winter snows and frigid temperatures. Then in the spring, we have flooding across entire continents for months at a time. In the summer, we have the droughts, the heat waves, the wildfires, destroying ecosystems. In the fall, the hurricanes and typhoons are undermining our coastal regions. Our ecosystems are collapsing with the water cycle, and our own species is now in trouble. Our scientists tell us we are in the 6th extinction of life on Earth. It doesn't even make the headlines. The most important moment in human history. The last time we had an extinction event was 65 million years ago. Now we're talking about in the lifetime of today's children. And our scientists say we could lose half the species on Earth in this century. How did this come to be? How did we get to the abyss? I want to go back in Western philosophy and Western theology to take a look at this. When you look at the first primary document of history in the West, it was the book of Genesis in the Abrahamic Bible. And I'm Jewish, but my Christian friends and Islamic friends are all part of the Abrahamic tradition. So if you look at the book of Genesis in the Garden of Eden, when God created Adam and Eve, they defied the Lord's mandate: do not eat the apple from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. I will expel you from the garden. Well, they ate the apple. He expelled them from the garden, so they would have to work by their own toil and not be in paradise. But he gave them a gift. He said to Adam, I'm going to give you a gift. I'm going to allow you to be the master of my creation. You shall dominate the natural world, all the things that live on this planet. That mandate in various incarnations took us all the way up through the hydraulic civilizations, the medieval agricultural revolution, the industrial age, and it culminated in the age of progress of the last 2 centuries of a fossil fuel-based industrial era. And what's interesting about it is that we don't have a playbook for what's going on. And here's the big unspoken. What I think most people are realizing now, just in the last 2 years, I mean all over the world, everywhere. They're realizing that this isn't going away. The floods, the droughts, the wildfires, the hurricanes, the destruction of ecosystems, the mass migrations of human populations, and they're scared to death. They're not talking about it. They're either scared to death or they're immobilized. And what they're beginning to realize is that this planet is much more powerful than we ever thought. And our species is much smaller and less significant in the future evolution of the Earth. This is a huge shift in human consciousness in the West. The Eastern traditions, Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism, philosophy of Confucianism, very different. As you know, in the East, the tradition is human beings are not the masters of nature, we are nature. We're not detached from nature. And we always need to harmonize with the rest of nature because we are of the same. Now, it's true that the Eastern part of the world has strayed from that tradition over time, but it's still in your cultural DNA. We'll come back to that later. And here's the real unspoken. It's the same narrative and worldview, the same set of ideas, the same assumptions and practices, the way we've organized our economic activity, how we've chosen to govern our species, our relationship to nature, our approach to scientific inquiry, how we educate our children, even our notion of selfhood. That Western tradition that culminated in the age of progress is what's taken us to an extinction in the depletion of the earth. So people are numb. Even the world institutions, the UN, the World Bank, the OECD, the IMF, they're using the same set of assumptions of the age of progress to actually try to cure the problem. It doesn't work. The bright spot here is the young children in China, Korea, Japan, Europe, America. Young people all over the world, the Gen Zs and young millennials have taken to the streets in peaceful protest. These Friday for Future events. They've left their schools, they've gone into the streets peacefully, and they've said, we're in a climate emergency. But what's different about these protests, anthropologically, these are not like any protest in human history. We've had protests all through history, where all sorts of misdeeds and grievances to be addressed. This is different. This is the first generation in all of history of humans that see themselves as a species. They see themselves as a species endangered. So all the other divisions, our ideological divisions, our loyalties to religion, our loyalties to community and blood ties, they're all still there, but they see themselves as an endangered species and they see their fellow creatures as part of the family. This is a real potential turning point in how we rethink the way we live on the earth. When we go back and take a look anthropologically at how we got here, we always have to understand that the big changes in history are infrastructure transformations, and I'll come back to that. The way we communicate power and move our economic life, governance, et cetera, and the infrastructures we create to do that. But key to every infrastructure is they change our temporal and spatial orientation. Let me go back in history. Forager hunters. For 200,000 years, our species were forager hunters, 95% of our time. And like every other species, our temporal orientation was the same as every other species. We are made up of myriad biological clocks in our tissues and our cells and our organs and our bodies. And those biological clocks, moment to moment, are adapting to the circadian rhythm of the planet as it rotates every day. And they are cueing and adapting to the seasonal rhythms as our planet moves across the sun. And so this is what every species does. They adapt to changes in the hydrosphere, lithosphere, atmosphere, and biosphere moment to moment. That's the temporal orientation. That all changed 10,000 years ago. The last ice age receded. We got a nice weather regime called the Holocene. Everyone settled down, no more foraging and hunting, small agriculture, pastoralization, then the great hydraulic civilizations, the Yellow River in China, the Sumerian Mesopotamian civilization in the West, the Indus Valley in India. I could go on, all the way to the age of progress in the Industrial Revolution. And here's the reset. For all of history until the last 10,000 years, we adapted to nature. The last 10,000 years, we made nature adapt to us. That's what's taken us to where we are at. And I'm going to come back to that later when I bring up the ecological civilization of China, because that's the blueprint for where we want to go. So let me take a look at the modern temporal value. It's called efficiency. Now, most people would think in China or America, well, haven't everybody tried to be efficient? Isn't that what a human being does? No, this is new. Efficiency is extracting greater volumes of the Earth's spheres, extracting more of the hydrosphere, the atmosphere, the lithosphere, and the biosphere in bigger volume at higher speeds in shorter time spans. Then we wondered why we depleted all of those spheres. We have, in order to tame nature and make it adapt to us. That's efficiency. And efficiency is also about eliminating friction. I work with the business community around the world. And so in the business community, we talk about being efficient, meaning we don't want any redundancy in our businesses. We want just lean production. We want only the inventory we need for the moment. Otherwise, we're spending too much money and the investors are not getting their returns. We want logistics and supply chains that are lean. We want labor forces that are lean because we need to be able to make sure that we can send revenue back to the investors. Well, then COVID hit. Where are the masks? Where are the ventilators? Where's the toilet paper? What we realize is this: there is no such thing as efficiency in nature. It does not exist in nature, all right? Nature is not about efficiency, it's about adaptivity. There is no such thing in nature as about productivity. There's no such thing. It's regenerativity in nature, not productivity, all right? There's no such thing as growth in nature. It's flourishing in nature. And to top it all off, and nature isn't lean. What makes nature resilient is that it's redundant and it's diverse, so that if there are changes in the climate of the atmosphere, the lithosphere, it has enough diversity, diversity so that it can maintain itself, all right? So all the basic features that make up the natural world to which we are part are completely different than the kind of economic values that we bring to bear in our economic system. We don't even understand the laws of thermodynamics in economics, which are the governing laws of the universe. It's pretty sad. But this is kind of, I think, where we are at this time. And there's also a change in our spatial values. For most of history, our species thought of the planet as a commons. There was rivalry, there was some warfare and all of that, but we were a commons. We organized ourselves as a commons all over the world. And although there were battles and struggles, that's what we saw ourselves as. The early economists, the French physiocrats, they got it right in the 1700s at the height of the medieval agricultural revolution. And the physiocrats said, look, all wealth is photosynthesis, net primary production, end of story, that's wealth. Then the British and Scottish economists came along and they took over the story. John Locke, the great political philosopher, he said, no, physiocrats, you're wrong. Nature is waste. That's his exact English words. Nature is of no value. That's his exact English words. It's passive. It only becomes valuable, John Locke said, when you add human labor to it and create capital. Completely misunderstanding how we live on this planet. So we see nature as passive resources that can be commodified, propertized, and consumed and discarded. And then we see we have propertized the entire oceans. Over half the oceans are property. We propertized almost the entire lithosphere. It's all property. We've propertized the atmosphere with air corridors and air rights and carbon credits, et cetera. And we've done the same thing with the biosphere. It's really an extraordinary thing, and most of it done in the last 200 years, the age of progress. What I'm seeing in our work with the European Union and China and briefly in the US, especially in the business community, I don't hear people talking about progress in the last 2 years. And that used to be every other word out of our mouth was progress, efficiency. I do not hear it anymore in corporate boardrooms. I hear adaptivity and resilience. They just don't know what it is. Because if they knew what it is, we'd have to change everything. And that's what the book's really all about, adaptivity and resilience. It's a big menu of what we need to do, but it's crucial that we have a new philosophical understanding of the planet we live in, or we will not be able to make it, even if we have new technologies that allow us to get there. When I began working with the European Union, Romano Prodi was president in 2000, and he came to Washington. He said, Jeremy, come to Europe. You've been in America too long, 25 years. We're going to lead this. And I took him up on it. I got 4 million frequent flyer miles doing it, but I commuted for 20 years. And we started our conversation in the EU with Romano Prodi as president. And I asked the question, how do the great economic paradigm shifts in history occur? If we know how they occur, maybe we can get a roadmap in the EU and a compass on what we could do next. When we look back anthropologically at history, we saw that there were 7 or 8 major economic paradigm shifts in all of history. They don't come often. And each one of them had the same common denominator, that at a moment in time, 3 technologies emerge across a society, often serendipity, and they converge to create a platform that allows us larger numbers of people to come together as a social organism to communicate, power, and move economic activity, social life, and governments. New communication revolutions, 1. New energy regimes, 2. New mobility and logistics modes, 3. This allows larger numbers of people to act as a social organism, which is what every cell does. Every cell and every organ and every organism has to have a means to communicate, a source of energy, and some form of mobility and motility. Infrastructures, governments do not create infrastructures. Infrastructures determine the possible opportunities and restraints and the types of governments you might have. It's not 1 or 2, but you could have a bunch, but you can't go beyond the infrastructure. Infrastructures create the economic models that come out of them, not the other way around. Those models can be many, but they have to stay within the infrastructure's confines. And it's the same with temporal-spatial orientation, same with habitats. Let's take a look. First industrial revolution, 19th century, Britain, communication revolution, steam power printing, no more manual print presses, big leap forward. And then telegraph system, last half of the century, bringing large numbers of people together over time and space, beginning of efficiency. Then the new energy regime, coal, they had denuded the forest. Now they go and mine the coal with the steam engine to get the coal out. Then they put the steam engine on tracks for railroads. That takes us to dense urban communities, national markets, nation states, and the capitalist shareholding corporation, because it was so expensive, you had to have lots of shareholders. Second industrial revolution, US, the communication, the telephone, Alexander Graham Bell connected the country. Later, radio and television. The new energy, cheap Texas oil. We didn't rely on coal as the only resource. And then Henry Ford put everybody into mobility, the internal combustion automobile. Then later, ocean traffic, air travel. This took us from dense urban environments to suburban build out, from national markets to globalization, and global mediating institutions like the UN, the OECD, the IMF. That second industrial revolution peaked and in the business community, but nobody talks about it. We know when it peaked. It peaked in July 2008 when oil hit $147 a barrel on world markets. That was a record. The whole economy shut down. That was the great economic earthquake of the 2 centuries of a fossil fuel-based industrial revolution. The collapse of the financial market 60 days later, the real estate mortgage Ponzi scheme, that was just an aftershock. Why was this the earthquake for the age of progress? Everything's about oil. We're learning this now in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Our food additives and preservatives, our pharmaceutical products, our cosmetics, most of our clothing, our construction materials, our heat, transport, light, it's on and on and on. So when oil goes over 80 a barrel, all the other prices go up. We hit inflation. You get to 120 or 30 a barrel, recession. This is what's going on now. So I'll share an anecdote with you. When Angela Merkel became chancellor, Germany, she invited me to come to Berlin in the first few weeks of the government to help her address the question, how do we move the German economy forward on her watch? The first question I asked the chancellor, I said, Madam Chancellor, how do you move the German economy forward when your businesses are plugged into a second industrial revolution, 20th century infrastructure of centralized telecommunication, fossil fuel nuclear power, internal combustion, road, rail, water, and air transport, and that infrastructure peaked in its performance over the last 2 decades. I said, you can have market reform and labor reform and fiscal reform and incentivize startup companies. But if they're plugged into that infrastructure, it has a life and it now has a death. On that first day, we talked about a third industrial revolution that we began to model. I first talked about it in a book called The End of Work back in 1995, and then the hydrogen economy, and I think it was around 2001. The third industrial revolution is the communication internet. 4.5 billion people connected, smartphone in their hand with more computing power, that little phone, than sent our astronauts to the moon, which is amazing, amazing. Now that 4.5 billion people connected on the communication internet with big data analytics and algorithms for news, knowledge, and entertainment, it's converging with a second internet. It's a digitized electricity internet made up of solar and wind electricity. All over the world, millions of people now are generating their own solar and wind electricity where they live, where they work, in their neighborhoods, in their agricultural fields. And what they're not using, they're storing batteries and pretty cell fuel cells and sending the surplus back up on an energy internet that's now going to cross nations. It's starting. Then under oceans within 10 years, we have the companies in my group who are doing the under ocean cable, and soon global. And so I had called for that global energy internet when I wrote The Hydrogen Economy. President Xi Jinping, to his credit, first world leader, went to the UN, I think it was 2014, and he gave a speech. He said, we need a global energy internet. First global leader to do that. This is, one of the reasons this is happening is the sun and the wind are everywhere. It can't be controlled by anybody. No government can control it, no global corporation, because you can just go off the grid wherever you like, all right? And then go back on the grid when you want. We will have millions now, pretty soon, hundreds of millions. And within 20 years, 1 billion plus people are going to be producing their own solar and wind. It's the cheapest energy in the world, way cheaper than all fossil fuels and nuclear and all of that. And that's the fixed cost. The marginal cost, near zero. Just keep it clean. The panels and the wind turbine. The wind and the sun have never sent a bill. Coal, oil, natural gas, uranium are really expensive to extract and process. What does this mean for how we're organizing? The first and second industrial revolution were centralized and top down. They had to be vertically integrated to create economies of scale because it was so expensive at that time to actually mine the coal. And then set up the railroad system, then the telegraph system, the telephone, the electricity, the gas pipeline. So you have to have shareholding corporations. And the first movers in every industry pretty much controlled it with centralized power, not just fossil fuels, but all across industry. And the Soviets did it the same way that we did in America. didn't make any difference. You had to get your returns. This third industrial revolution infrastructure is quite different. Berners-Lee, who created the World Wide Web, he's going to have the last laugh. Because he said, I want to build a web that everybody can participate with everyone else at the margins and don't have to rely on some vertical referee at the center to dictate the terms, right? Now, the first generation of these companies, Microsoft, Dell, Facebook, Google, they were vertically integrated, right? They won't be here in 40 years from now as we know them. The reason is there's too much data. We are turning this planet into a brain and a nervous system. You have your own satellites. We have GPS. The Europeans have Galileo. The Russians have theirs. That's the satellites, the brain. The nervous system are the trillions of sensors that make up the Internet of Things. So we're placing sensors in the wild, which is good to monitor the climate. We're placing sensors in the agricultural fields to monitor the soil. We're putting sensors in homes for smart homes and smart vehicles and factories, et cetera. We're literally digitizing the planet so that we can know moment to moment what's happening to the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, the atmosphere, the biosphere. And the data is so intense, these big centralized data centers from these vertically integrated giants, they can't handle it. So we have a new concept called fog computing. I think you probably heard of it, not cloud computing, fog computing. If you have an autonomous vehicle about to crash, and you send that data to a remote, big vertically integrated data center, even though it's like that, too slow. It crashes. We are setting up edge data centers around the world. They're going to be so cheap, where anybody can set up an edge data center with a small and medium-sized high-tech enterprise or a cooperative. And these are fluid platforms that are agile and can change at a moment's notice. These big vertically integrated global companies, how are they going to adapt to moment-to-moment climate disasters in a warming climate that's unpredictable? And all the big data and analytics in the world will not tell you what this planet's doing because it's past data. And the planet's evolving in new ways every moment with climate change. That past data can give you some reference point, but that's about it. What all this means is that we're going to see a great shift to a more distributed form of economic life. We call it small and medium-sized high-tech enterprises in fluid cooperative platforms that can come in and out. Some of the big companies will stay. Some of them that I work with, they'll be aggregators working alongside these high-tech companies. And this is going to take us from globalization to glocalization. Absolutely, it's happening right now because the digital infrastructure is so cheap that anybody can engage anyone else in the world at a moment's notice, and they don't need the middleman, and it's cheap as hell. So globalization doesn't mean going all back to our little confines. It's still global, but global. I'll give you an idea, a suggestion, a thought. You know 3D printing, fabricated manufacturing, 3D printing, right? 3D printing's everywhere now. They're building homes, they're building wind turbine bases, bridges, et cetera. I'll give you one example. In architecture, there's a lot of suburban developments now where they are 3D printing homes in 24 hours. An architect in Italy this recently, Cucinella, took soil, clay, which is traditionally what buildings were built on, either that or trees, forests, lumber. And he developed the software so the clay would be heated up, and the software let it add up moment to moment and create an entire building. You can do it in 200 hours, you can do it in 24 hours. Zero emission, resilient, and made out of the local stock. All right, in a climate world, a good idea. Now, how does it deal with globalization? He can take the software that built this building, and he can create a provider user network, not a seller buyer market. As we move towards zero emission and as we move to near zero footprint, we can move from seller buyer markets to ESCOs, energy service companies, and provider user networks. So Mr. Cucinella, the architect, can take the software for that home, and he can create a license with a developer in Philippines who can then, on this provider user network, build out all the homes he wants, as long as he's continuing with the license. Provider user network, completely different model. Absolutely different model. It's a more distributed, democratized form of economic life that relies more on very high-tech SMEs in fluid platforms that operate like the diversity in an ecosystem, rather than a monoculture, vertically integrated giant companies. Some of them will survive. A lot of them will not. As we were moving into this whole third industrial revolution, we did not see how it would morph in ways we did not understand, actually. What happened somewhere around 2012 or 2013, we began to realize that this distributed infrastructure was morphing into something that would probably be the last industrial revolution. And we saw this third industrial revolution probably maturing into the first resilient infrastructure by around 2040 or 2050. The actual third industrial revolution infrastructure was a hybrid. It was the last of the infrastructures. And I'll share this. This is a list we made up, all of our global team of businesses, architects, urban planners, utility people, transportation, logistics that we saw. We are just beginning to see, it's no longer a theory, and it's not at the center, but at the margins, an age of resilience emerging. A younger generation, in business at least, is pivoting from growth to flourishing, from finance capital to ecological capital, from productivity to regenerativity, from GDP to quality of life indicators, from hyperconsumption to eco-stewardship, from negative externalities, thermodynamics, to circularity, from ownership to access, from seller, buyer, markets to provider, user networks, from linear to cybernetic processes, from vertically integrated economies of scale to laterally distributed economies of scale, from, we mentioned corporate conglomerates to small and medium-sized high-tech enterprises, from intellectual property rights to open source sharing of knowledge, from globalization to globalization, and most importantly, from geopolitics to biosphere politics. Geopolitics is the fossil fuel era. We had to have huge militaries because fossil fuels are concentrated and uranium. And that we fought many wars with fossil fuels. I don't have to remind everyone, millions of people died. World War II, when France invaded the Ruhr Valley of Germany and took the coal, it was inevitable. World War II. When what happened when we, the US in July of 1941, stopped shipments of oil from Southeast Asia to Japan, Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor four months later. Millions of people died. Hopefully this is the last fossil fuel war. And what we're seeing, interestingly enough, is the militaries are changing their mission, because as we move to solar and wind, they don't need to be protecting the security. We're going to get over this last hump. And what's interesting is they're doing resilience. In my country, the military, even though they didn't intend to, they are dealing with the forest fires. They're dealing with the floods. They're dealing with the rescues. They're dealing with the restoration. They're dealing with building resilient infrastructure because you need large numbers of people who are trained. We're going to see a shift from the Department of military departments based on geopolitics to militaries based on resilience, the age of resilience. It's already starting everywhere. What I'd like to do now is I want to change gears for the last 10 or 15 minutes here. I think the most important part of the book is part 3. We need to understand what a human being is. We are an ecosystem. The National Institutes of Health, which is just a few blocks from my office, they've come up with a new approach to science, which is the big breakthrough. It's called the Human Biome Project. This is an amazing project from the greatest scientific institution in the world, National Institute of Health. What they have decided and discovered is the human being is actually an ecosystem, not a metaphor. We are actually an ecosystem. And that is that our body is constantly bringing a medium, semi-permeable medium, that's bringing in elements, it's bringing in the water, in our molecules, in our cells, which is 60% of everything in the body, bringing in the elements from the lithosphere, the phosphorus, the nitrogen, all of that, in our cells, in our organs, in our tissue. The phosphorus in my teeth came from a mountain, degraded by the waters into sediment that made the soil, and that phosphorus moved up to the plants, the animals, and came to my teeth, and will go somewhere else. The human body is actually moving all the time as an ecosystem. except for our eye lens, some of our brain cells, phosphorus in our teeth, the rest of it comes and goes. The whole human skeleton is replaced every 10 years. The whole liver is replaced every year. Our stomach cells every month. So we are a medium. And then it gets more interesting. We're not alone. What the National Institute of Health is telling us, you're an ecosystem. We are. That there are all sorts of other creatures in our body that we're just starting to try to understand. The protists, the archaea, the fungi, the bacteria and viruses, trillions of them in this micro ecosystem. Over half the cells in the human body are not human cells. They belong to these other creatures. Humans are only 20,000 genes, human genes. There are millions of other genes in our body. This is an ecosystem. This is a huge new story. The Eastern traditions got it right. We are nature. We are nature, not a metaphor. And this is very comforting for a younger generation of scientists and engineers and just a human race to realize we're not alone. Each of us is unique, but we are ecosystems within ecosystems within ecosystems. All of us are part of the hydrosphere, lithosphere, atmosphere, and biosphere, and we all have a role to play. It's really a comforting message for young people to know this. And of course, we have our biological clocks that entrain us to the planet's rotation, even our electromagnetic fields in our bodies. We now know we believe play an architectural role in deciding how the DNA lines up. There's experiments in the books that are peer-reviewed in the last few years about this. Where do we go from here? We need a new approach to governance. We don't give up nation states, we don't give up regions, we don't give up municipalities, but guess what? The climate doesn't care about political boundaries. Climate disasters do not care about political boundaries. They care about ecosystems. We're beginning to realize that we have to have governance, keep our governance, but an extension so we can begin to have jurisdiction across common ecosystems. My country is ahead. This is the one place we're ahead. We have two great bioregional governances in US and Canada, 30 years. We have the Canadian Pacific and Northwest US Pacific, the states, the 5 states in the US, 2 provinces, several territories. They are in a bioregional governance for their entire Cascadia forested region, for their stewarding it, for their economics, for their businesses and jobs. We have another one, 30 years in the making, all formalized between the 8 US states that abut the Great Lakes. Great Lakes are 20% of the fresh water in the world in those lakes. And the Canadian provinces of Ontario and Quebec, and they steward that, they manage it, they have legislation, they have economic activity, but they learn to adapt to their ecosystem rather than trying to adapt the ecosystem to their short-term needs. It's adaptivity, not efficiency. It's where they're going. We also, I think, have to begin to take a look at how we approach science, if I may, all right? The Western tradition is Baconian science. Francis Bacon said, the man was not made for the earth. The earth was made for man. That's his exact quote. And then we wonder why we're at the abyss. And he said, we take nature and we detach ourselves from it because we are rational. We don't worry about our senses, our physicality. We are a rational, detached human being. And we use induction and reduction to pry nature's secrets and adapt nature to our short-term utilities, to Bentham utilities. Extinction event. There's a new science emerging, which you're all familiar with. And it's very exciting. It's happening in China. I work with the National Academy of Science, Wang Yi there and others. It's great. China's doing it, American scientists, but the public doesn't know. It's called complex, adaptive, social, ecological systems modeling. We're breaking down the academic silos. And so we're beginning to realize that this planet is so complicated, every discipline has something to bring to the table. Anthropology, psychology, physics, chemistry, maybe even economics. And we have to begin to work together across our disciplines to try to understand, anticipate, and adapt to a complex world where our planetary spheres are self-organizing and they are animated and they're now really rewilding. So we have to do what Dewey and the pragmatist said, anticipate, adapt in a very sophisticated way with complex adaptive social ecological systems modeling. We'd also have to begin to take a look at education. That's the last thing. Our children are born with, they are born with an empathic impulse in the neural circuitry. They are. And E.O. Wilson, a great Harvard biologist, before he passed away, wrote a book on biophilia. They also are born to have an empathic impulse with their fellow creatures. When little toddlers have dreams, 4-year-olds, 3-year-olds, you know what they dream about? 60% of their dreams are about other animals, little animals, baby animals, because they see the little ants carrying little food. They see a bird building a nest. It's exciting. Then they get to school. No. These are mechanical objects. They're just doing nothing. They're passive. We have to use them. René Descartes was right. They're just machinery. Then we wonder. Now, this is one other place America is a little bit ahead. Every other place, Europe and China are definitely leading. But we have 8 of our 12 public school systems with millions of students are actually using ecology, not as a course, but a frame of reference for the other disciplines. And the students are required to have clinical learning. What they learn in their interdisciplinary studies, they have to go out in the community, steward the ecosystems. Don't think about ecology just on a screen with pixels. That's not it. Live out there. Experience your education, both virtually and physically, but be a part of the natural world. Check the carbon footprint, protect our fellow animals, build corridors for our species, etc. This, I think, are some of the changes that we need to take a careful look at. I think it's a tough journey ahead. When my team did the plan for Senate Majority Leader Schumer, which became much of the centerpiece of the Biden plan, they didn't scale it, unfortunately, didn't have the money, but at least it's a start. We developed a plan, our industry's $17 trillion 20-year plan, all granular. Every dollar GDP invested, $3 return. We laid out 78 million microgrids, a lot of utility scale grids, an infrastructure that could be climate resilient, everything underground, logistically making resilient logistic infrastructure. We had the whole thing in there. And all of it is, from a commercial point of view and technical point of view, available today. And it can be done in 20 years. What's holding us back? Politics. It's old, it's governments wedded to old codes, old regulations, old standards, and old business interests. The finances are there. $11 trillion have flooded out of fossil fuels. It's stranded assets. Solar and wind's are cheap. 11 trillion. And 42 trillion of that are pension funds. 23 trillion are insurance funds. So where we're at is the money is there. We need scaled projects in each of the regions. What I would say is I'm guardedly hopeful, and my last thought is the ecological civilization. This is a radical change in how we perceive life. I read an essay by President Xi Jinping. I read it over and over and over again, 42 pages. This is a document for the future of the planet. Regardless of which country came up with it, China has got a document that every world leader should read, every university and high school student should read, because it's saying we need a reset. Instead of adapting nature to us, we have to adapt ourselves to nature. And we have to make sure that nature, our well-being is based on nature's regenerativity. Our well-being is based on being adapting to nature's needs for diversity and redundancy. This is where we need to head. It's a big journey. And I am very pleased that China is taking such a leadership role here along with the EU. We call ours Green Deal, Digital Europe Green Deal. You call yours China Internet Plus Ecological Civilization, but you're one continent. And yeah, you're having geopolitical, everybody's arguing about geopolitics, which is, I'm an old man, but it shocks me. Everyone's arguing about geopolitics based on an era that's now dying, the age of progress. And that we're an extinction event and should be talking about biosphere politics and sharing the sun, sharing the wind across global time zones, sharing the planet, re-enriching the soil, making sure that each of us is responsible for our biosphere. That's what we should be doing. We need biosphere politics. We got to leave geopolitics behind. We have to see ourselves as a species and our fellow creatures as part of the family. Not rocket science, what I'm saying, kind of common sense, I guess.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. So it's a really wonderful, insightful talk. Now, I guess we can shift to discussing. Let me briefly introduce the first Professor Mikan. Mikan is a professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. She's specialized in urban planning, and we're from the same university, same department actually. So anyways, without further ado, I'll give the floor to Professor Ng.
Thank you, Professor Xu, and it is my greatest honor to be a discussant of Professor Rifkin's talk. I really enjoy your talk. Your talk is always very inspiring, very thought-provoking. I'm actually the director of the Urban Studies program at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. I really feel like energized after hearing the talk, and I would like really to talk to my students. I actually have invited them, but it's an examination season, and maybe that's why they are not here. Your talk actually about like the importance of having this sustainable ecological thinking in terms of organizing the school curriculum is actually like the philosophy that we have adopted in developing the interdisciplinary, if not transdisciplinary, urban studies program in the university. Your insights and your ideas, about, say, for example, this convergence of communication, energy, and transportation, logistics, that creates common platforms that has implications for the way that we power ourselves, to govern ourselves, or even the built environment, they are also very much, central to our curriculum. So it's like we do have a lot of sort of like common thoughts, and also the way that we are trying to do. So, or like, our discussion about the importance of having 15 minutes neighborhood, building compact cities. I think these are all sort of like really what you have talked about. They are very, very relevant, to the curriculum that we are still developing, in the coming years. So I have a few thoughts that I would like to ask, or maybe share as well. The first one is it's about the futures. I understand that from reading your books, in a sense, they apply more to the American or the Western context. I'm thinking like, okay, I also now understand that you've contributed to our country's future development as well. So I'm thinking like for non-American or non-Western economies or societies, how relevant are the arguments that you have sort of like presented in front of us? I'm asking myself, like, is this digital infrastructure, a lot of people are talking about smart cities infrastructure. Are they the must for the future? And if we are really talking about resilience, should there be different pathways to resilience? Such as our ecological civilization. I understand that, we also are building this digital infrastructure. We probably are building much faster than the rest of the world. But in a sense, ecological civilization is more about going back to the roots of our own civilization, our own history, our own philosophy. Also, we thinking and reflecting on our proper position in nature. I think that is something in the blood of every Chinese, because we all, if you look at Chinese painting, you always see very small human beings, but the big landscape. Something that, that's a question about the future that you also touch upon, that you talk about, that it's time for us to move on from geopolitics to biosphere politics. I think that is great if people can really overcome their vested interest and see the commonwealth of nature, of humankind, in face of climate crisis, in face of all these environmental problems. But we all understand from your books, you also talk about the dark side of this common platform, that eventually, if it's being developed, that this powerful Internet of Things, of course, can do good, but it could also allow people to have more control. And then, in this age when even machines my son just told me that, about this generative pre-trained transformer 3, that they use AI and humanize, robots. They can actually produce humanized text. And he told me that, they can do parallel sort of like humanized text in one go, like, endless versions. If that's the case, with so many different discourses around, how can we persuade people that, certain interpretations of the present and also like the way forward should be adopted? So that's something that I also, have would like to listen to your views. And also in terms of education, I really hope you can also enlighten us about like how can you develop this capacity to join things together so that you can have such, a brilliant view of this big picture. I think that capacity is really something that I really truly admire. And also, I would like to know about your optimism, especially about the millennials that you praise so much. I see so many millennials in my daily life, I have to say. And we've tried to sort of like brainwash them in a sense, with all these ideas. But even 4 years of education, some of them may not be sort of like truly converted. They may say something that, they can get good grades, but if you look at their lifestyle, they may not be truly converted. And also I sort of Professor Rifkin, in your beginning you mentioned about the story in the Bible. Well, as a Christian, I think we all understand that we are not the master of nature. God is the master of nature, and in the Bible it's very clear that it's because of human sin, not listening to God, eating the fruits from the tree of, differentiating good from evil, that creates all the mess that we are in. So how come you are so optimistic about the nature of human beings, so that we'll have a better future, that we'll take this opportunity and create this age of resilience, in face of the crisis that we are in? So I really enjoy your talk, and I also would like to listen to your views on some of my thoughts as well. Thank you.
Great.
This is a book. These are great questions. So should I respond to this?
Yeah,
right
please,
now?
please respond.
Okay.
Yeah, respond.
All right. While the Eastern tradition, you still have in your cultural DNA, if not in practice, you have it in the cultural DNA. We are nature. We harmonize with nature, which is another word for adapt to nature. We are nature. All right. That's a strong suit. In the West, there is a minority report, as you know. For example, the Enlightenment, which is all about rational, detached, mechanical universe. There was a minority report, the Romantic era, that we are part of nature. All right. In the 19th century, it was in Europe where ecology became the scientific discipline. In the 20th century, US built the great national parks. I mean, you let them stay, so they were preserved. And then in Europe, in the United States, it was Silent Spring, that book that touched off the modern environmental movement. And after that, the Green parties in Europe, which I worked with the leadership in Germany and Italy about. So we have something to offer as well in all three places. I would say I'm not optimistic, by the way, or pessimistic. That does you no good. As an activist, I'm optimism, you wait around for the good news, and pessimism, you wait around for the bad news. I am guardedly hopeful, but not naive. I'm always guardedly hopeful, but this is a really defining, difficult moment, unlike anything in history. You know this, I know this, we're running out of time. The strong suit, I'm gonna say something that's going to be very encouraging, I think, I hope. The Smithsonian Institution, the great Smithsonian Anthropological Institution of Washington, D.C., the government. They did a study a few years ago. It's changed everything. They asked, how did human beings survive over all this period of time? We are the youngest species, but hominids have been here 800,000 years, then Neanderthals, and we, Homo sapiens, been here a couple 100,000 years. How did we survive? The old story is the last ice age receded 10,000 years ago, nice climate. We settled down to agriculture, pastoralization, all the way to the industrial age. And we traveled across the whole planet. Well, Then they went back and they looked at the geological record, and that wasn't the way it happened. It wasn't the way it happened. It turns out that the last 800,000 years before the last ice age receded was one of the most dangerous changes in climate in much of history. Unbelievable radical changes in the climate because of a shift in the rotation of the Earth. If the orbit was tilting. So beginning around 800,000 years ago, and that's when hominid developed, we would have 100,000 years of an ice age, and then only 10,000 years of warming, then another 100,000 years of ice age, then 10,000 of warming, then another 100,000 years of ice age, then 10,000 years of warming. It went on like this for 800,000 years as our species evolved. So how did this little spindly creature with two little legs, no fur, no strength, cross the planet during that period? Well, they decided the reason we're probably the most adaptive species, with the exception of viruses and bacteria, et cetera, a mammalian species. Why? Big brain, language. As we learn things, we can share them with future generations and build up our knowledge. And then the most important thing I would add, we have empathy in our neural circuitry. We're not sure about elephants, whales, and dolphins. They were, of course, land mammals first and went back to the ocean. But elephants can see themselves in a mirror. We think they may have an empathic impulse. They do more than they're dead. Empathy is an interesting impulse because it allows us to actually physically experience another. It can be a human being or anything that's alive, if they're in trouble, or if they're in jubilation, or if they're in anguish. We can literally feel in our own neural circuitry. And empathy is actually determines our mind, not some rational, detached, mechanical idea of the philosophers of the Enlightenment. This is our strong suit. But here's the problem. I wrote a book a long time ago, The Empathic Civilization. I think the China translation was not good. It required somebody with 650 pages. I'm just saying this here. I mean, it was okay, I guess, but it was a complicated book. It needed, anyway. So, but what I found out in that book, I took about 10 years on this book. When we look back at history, foragers and hunters had empathy. They were blood ties only and kindred group. If you were another human group in another valley, you were a demon. But they were the ultimate caregivers for their children. They're the gold standard in care. When you go up to the great hydraulic civilizations, like in the Yellow River Valley, the Indus Valley in India, the Tigris and Euphrates, all the great religions started right at the time the great hydraulic civilization started, not an accident. And the reason is all these people had to come together, most of them slaves, thousands of them that were not blood related, to build the dams and the dikes and the royal granaries and the royal road systems and the coinage and all of that. They had to have some form of empathic embrace. The religions became their new parental figures, if you will, all right, in good ways. Jesus was the ultimate empathic figure in history. So when all the people came into Rome and they didn't have blood relations, they were all alone and frightened, they became converts. And when they would meet each other in the street, they had similar clothes so they could identify each other. They would kiss on each cheek, which Europeans still do, and say, hello, brother, hello, sister. We are the brothers and sisters of Jesus. What I'm saying is that empathy expands and collapses in history. It can expand and collapse. We can have expansion and then bear up bad times. You go up to the nation state age, where you had to bring large numbers of independent cultures together under national heading. Guess what? The nation state became the parental figure. People will die for their country, like they'll die for their religion, like they'll die for their tribe, right? The issue here is that we do see empathy expand and collapse. And now the young people are biophilic. They really are beginning to relate not only to our species as a whole, but to our fellow creatures. Here's the problem. All those former attachments are still here. We're still fighting blood wars. We're still fighting tribal wars as I speak to you right now on the earth, this hour. We're still fighting religious wars this hour on the earth. We're still fighting ideological wars, geopolitical wars this hour on the earth. These other past empathic embraces They can still be here. One can think of ourselves as a species and still have our religion, which is good, our beliefs in an afterworld. We could still have our national ties because we affiliate with people that are in the same government. We can still have our blood ties. But sometimes it's a threat to these old forms of consciousness when a new one comes, this time biophilia consciousness. We're part of the planet. Hopefully that won't be the case, but it's a big journey to get there. And there's a lot of impediments on the way. You mentioned the digital revolution. I'm a big fan of a digital revolution, but I don't think people should be indoors on the screen for 80 years of their life and still think they understand the planet they live in. It's absurd. The digital revolution ought to help us for infrastructure, but it's so sad to me to see 4, 5, 6-year-olds on a flat screen with pixels trying to understand the world. And what's happened now is Homo urbanus, 2006, we became mainly urban. In my country, 92% of the time we're indoors every day, 7 hours a day on the screen. I'm sure it's similar everywhere else. They've done studies. We are escaping and getting more and more into a metaverse as if this is going to save us. This is the road to extinction. We use virtual worlds. Sometimes we'll have to be indoors. Climate change is here. Sometimes we'll have to be outdoors. We need to digitize planets so that we can begin to monitor the Earth, live together, and each of us be responsible for our own biosphere as well. The strong suit that I've seen on climate change, and I'll end with this, when there's a climate disaster, a flood, a drought, a wildfire, you know what we notice? Empathy everywhere. People rescuing each other for their own life in jeopardy, going into flooded waters when they can't swim and taking an old lady out, taking a small cat or dog out of a raging fire when they could be killed. This happens in every climate event. This is our strong suit. This is who we really are. People don't run. They help each other. I think that's our strong suit. It's going to be up to the academic community to begin to open up new visions for how we see ourselves in the planet. It's a really difficult task, but also it's rewarding. So I hope I've given you my sense of what I think the opportunities and limits are of digital world. I'm all for it. We put it together for Europe and we help with you in China. The last thing I would say, you mentioned about this being used and abused. So, you know, everyone's worried about the global energy internet. Everybody's worried about, you know, would some superpower take over all the sun and the wind in the world if it was all connected as an energy internet? That's a term I introduced in the hydrogen economy. Guess what? It can't happen. And I don't think there's any intention in China to have this happen. I really don't. I don't think there's any intention in Europe to have this happen. I don't even think there's any intention in America to have this happen. And even if it were, it can't happen. Because this solar and wind is so distributed. How could any power control all the sun and all the wind on all the landscapes of the world? Yes, the smile is appropriate. It can't be done. If, as we move toward a global energy internet, let's say some renegade country wanted to control it all, everybody else will just go off the grid because there's going to be hundreds of millions of microgrids attached to continental and global grids. And within 2 seconds, you just go off the main grid and reconnect your microgrids. That's going to happen. That's not going to go away. All right. When MIT asked me, as you know, we had this Belt Road thing going in China. I was in on some of those conversations. And I said, yeah, and a railroad's great and a sea route, but you know, we also have to think digital. Eurasia is one continent. Europe's China's #1 trading partner. China's Europe's second major trading partner. They're about to be the same, and they're in one continent. I suggested we talk about the digital infrastructure, and I was pleased. CIID, MIT did it. They asked me to write the introduction to the Digital Silk Road plan, which is now in some ways superseded the Belt Road. I was pleased and honored to do it. I think that we're on the right track here with that, for sure. And it forces us to share the planet, because when the sun is shining in one part of the world, one time zone, you have to share it with another because it's intermittent. When the wind's blowing somewhere else, you got to share it with some other time zone. It forces sharing, and it forces us to think that we're all part of the same planet. and we rely on the sun and the wind of the earth. That's biosphere politics. Don't need a big military for that.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Let's invite the second discussant, Professor Bu Liang from Nanjing University. Just a brief introduction. Professor Bu is a professor in the Nanjing University, and he's also an adjunct professor at Hopkins Nanjing Center. So he has published many articles, and he also serves as an editor for the Asia Pacific Journal of Management and also the Journal of International Management and other journals. Without further ado, I'll give the floor to Professor Bu.
Thank you very much, Professor Xu. And yes, it's a big honor to speak to you directly, Professor Jeremy. So yeah, as Professor Mikan just mentioned that, we are so excited, there's a lot we need to digest, so you helped greatly to open us our eyes, to see how to see the world. Yeah. So what Professor Xu didn't missed in the introduction, that is, I'm a professor from the business school, but however, my wife is a professor from School of the Environment. So many of our colleagues also know here. So yeah, so we have sometimes we also discuss some you see these tensions here. Yeah. So part of my thinking is also inspired by your fantastic talk today. So may I share my screen? I just use one slide to
sure, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So I like to reflect my my questions. Yeah. So this is really a precious opportunity to have this direct conversation. So first question here. Yeah. So as Jamie, you just mentioned many about Chinese, so some indigenous knowledge, so difference between East and the West. I've been also thinking about this recently, and in particular, that in China recently we had the 20th Party Congress. So there, I observed a little bit interesting, I think something new. That is, I would like to first, that is to compare the difference between the promoting harmony between humanity and the nature. This is the Chinese way, So why or the least? The second, that is sustainable development. So we are all familiar with, for example, like UN SDGs, the 17 SDGs. Yeah. So one thing you probably don't know, that is, in the Chinese, the 20th Party, this Congress, in this official document, report. So can you guess, how many times, if we compare these two concepts, which one is, more or which one is less? So that the up one or lower one? Probably very challenging. Let me tell you that is, in fact, it's 5 times more. Okay, that is, you are using the word promoting harmony between the humanity and the nature compared with sustainable development. So that's really motivate me, and also today your talk, that is to think about, are there some differences, some subtle but important difference between these two. Yeah. So this can be also linked with from your talk. So I like to hear how do you view their potential these differences here. And I think understanding this kind of difference could be critical, to understand what's this. You just mentioned that ecological civilization, what it really means, from President Xi's. This is the first question. I have only 2 questions. And the second, that is, from a little bit background we share, in common. As also I introduced my wife, and I know that you taught at Wharton Business School, the top business school, for many years. Yeah. So in business school or in business world, also, I'm feel puzzled. I'm really struggling by this, to see the divide between the business school or business world with the environment. Okay. So that is, on one side, only environment side, that we see this crisis, not only climate change, but diversity, many, including you told us today. Yeah. Yeah. However, on the other side, from business school, though we see that, I'm doing research shift a little bit from sustainability from environment also to corporate social responsibility, right?
Mhm.
We are talking about, including, different ESG, for example, recently. Yeah.
Mm.
But however, we still see there's still huge divide between these two worlds. Okay, let's use
Yeah.
different language, from the environment side, they criticize greatly, for business world. But however, they don't understand, long-term goal, short-term goal, corporate governance,
Mhm.
profit, for all
Mhm.
these, business school word we use. But from business school side, that is, seems that is we have, indeed that is, very limited knowledge about the environment. As you say, we need to learn. Human is also, ecosystem like this.
Yeah.
So yeah, so this divide persists, still, even now. Okay. So when I read your books, there's all this, yeah. So I'm thinking about, really, how the difficulty, how to change the mindset. You talk about education, talk about many other issues, but I'm wondering when this kind of stuff, when this kind of change or shift can really take place, and or what kind of difficulty, because I think you are really the one of the, very few people probably in this planet that can really understand the difficulties is such kind of transition, from this currently we see the business world. Then you see the great challenges, for those, as you said, that you are not optimistic on, pessimistic, but how to see, how to view the difficulties, ahead, to achieve this. Talking about the age of resilience. Okay, so yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I'm also representing our here, in the group, to appreciate your opportunity. Yeah, thanks.
Well, what you raised is very deep and substantial. I'd have to say, I went to the word school when I was a young man as a student, but I taught the advanced management program there for 15 years. That's our CEO program. We bring in CEOs from around the world for 5 weeks. I taught every session for 15 years. And what I began to realize is that economics is probably the weakest profession to make the change, because it has no understanding of the laws of thermodynamics. I'm sure you and your wife have talked about the laws of thermodynamics. They just don't know. And the fact is that the economics profession is wedded to a Newtonian mechanical view of the world, and that Newton's mechanics is without time zero. For every plus t, there's a minus t. All right. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, but it doesn't relate to the passage of time. By using that mechanical model, what economists do is they disregard the basics of thermodynamics, which govern all of the activity that keeps anything alive on the planet. There are first and second laws of thermodynamics. The first law says all the energy in the universe is constant since the Big Bang. Nothing's been created or destroyed since. All is there. Second law says, yeah, that's the conservation law, but the second law says, well, but energy is always changing form. Even though no new energy is created or old energy destroyed, but that change is always from hot to cold, from concentrated to dispersed through the galaxies. All right. So entropy is a measure of energy that's there but not available any longer to do work. When a business takes a look at their value chain, let me give you an example. When a lion chases down an antelope and kills it and devours it, only 10 to 20% of the actual energy in that antelope gets placed into the next part of the food chain of the lion. The rest is heat loss. It's the entropy bill. All right. When a business is taking a look at its value chain, it's only interested in each step from extraction to shipment to storage to production to exchange. That at exchange is the last time they look at what the value is. They do not look at the fact that at every step in that value chain, extraction, shipment, storage, production, exchange, there are negative externalities rippling out across the entire earth, literally, forever and ever, changing everything, the molecules, the elements, everything. And if you add up all those negative externalities from any given good or service, they overwhelm whatever the little value was of that good or service when it was actually exchanged between the producer and the buyer. And it's called the toxification of the oceans, the depletion of the soil, the poisoning of the atmosphere. It goes on and on and on. This is now, it wasn't that economics profession wasn't warned. Frederick Soddy, the great Nobel laureate chemist of the early 20th century, said, look, guys, the rise and fall of nations is all based on the first and second laws of thermodynamics. Albert Einstein said, guess what? There's only two laws in the universe I'm sure will never be overthrown, the universal, the first and second laws of thermodynamics. Einstein thought his laws wouldn't even make it, all right? Ilya Prigogine, who I had, another Nobel laureate who I had the privilege to spend an hour and a half with when I was a young man, he said the same thing. And then it was Georgescu Rogan, who was my mentor. He wrote the foreword to my book, Entropy, in 1980. He understood it. Economics really has got to move. We need a new generation of interdisciplinary studies so that economics can learn from the ecologists, who can learn from the physicists, can learn from the chemists, can learn from the anthropologists, and start to understand that we live in a world where the planet is alive, it's animated, it's self-organizing, and totally unpredictable. That's why there's very little that we can do in economics or any other discipline based on past data. I said this before, and analytics and algorithms, because past data is so immaterially small compared to the momentary changes of those four spheres, and now through rewilding because of climate change. Anybody that's actually has the gall to think that past data and analytics is going to tell you what's happening, they have no clue. What we can do is we can have a little bit of knowledge. We always use it to sort of anticipate and then be a participant with nature and listen and watch and then adapt. Listen and watch and adapt. Listen and watch and adapt. Now, in the turn of the last century, the pragmatist scientists like Dewey, they came to China. Dewey spent a long time in China. There was a lot of back and forth between your idea of harmony with nature and his idea that everyone is part of nature in terms of experiencing it. So we brought a little bit of the West to the East and learned a lot from you folks in the East at that time. I go back to this essay, The Ecological Civilization. It's really good. It really is 40 pages. It's good. And it's basic. The fact that the Communist Party of China would actually introduce an amendment to the Constitution saying all future development must be adhered to nature, that's a big deal. I think it's a really big deal. I think we need to see that there's something that we can bring to the table from all the great places of the world. Not only Europe and America and China, but all the not developed countries that have indigenous culture, indigenous knowledge that actually is probably more wise than we ever believed, much more wise. It's not just something that's, quote, in. There's a lot they can teach us about how one adapts to nature rather than nature adapting to us. Now, that doesn't mean that all indigenous cultures have done a good job, but there's a lot to be learned there. I hope that helps a little bit. So tell your colleagues, no more Newtonian mechanics, ask them to read the laws of thermodynamics, and then spend more time with your wife, the ecologist. And the two of you can share with her, there's a lot of economic ideas that have to keep with us. You share the economic ideas, have her share the ecological ideas, and the two of you have created a complex, adaptive, social, ecological systems model. Now, every once in a while, you'll have to take a break and go out in nature and take a walk. But this would be a very good start.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, and that's also a good reason to stay away from these screens.
Yeah, stay away from the screen. Only once in a while is a treat, but not all day long.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, and also Mo Liang. Let's get to the Q&A parts. If you have, for the audience, if you have any questions, you can either write it in the chat box, And also, if you want, you can also raise your hand, and then we can call your name, and then you can ask a question. Now we have two questions in the chat box from Leo. So the first question is, can you explain in detail how the future generations make money by ecological capital? Second question is how to build a resilient society, and do you have any suggestions for China? As you know that China is still a developing country, nearly 600 million people earn just $150 per month, and GDP is still quite important for the governmental officials to get higher positions. To attract more companies to make investment is still the driver of GDP growth. So what is how do you have any suggestions for China to become a more resilient society? These are two questions. Jeremy.
Yeah. In terms of becoming a resilient society, the infrastructure plans that we work with Europe, China, and the U.S. And it's not rocket science. We were just compiling all of the technologies that work. I mean, there's so many technologies that are market-wise, they're ripe, they're ready to go to lay out the communication, energy, mobility, logistics, refashion our urban areas. We're going to have a lot of businesses that deal with ecosystem services. We have to allow the soil to replenish itself. Now, here's where China is ahead as well. As you know, E.O. Wilson, before he passed away, said, we got to rewild 1/2 the earth, Harvard biologist. The UN decided 1/3. It's going to be very tough to do that. The problem is, the real problem here, the next step of this climate problem, is we're losing the soil. I think we've lost about 40% of the soil already. It takes 500 years to get an inch of soil back. We could be eliminating most of the soil within the next 50 years. Here's the problem. The soil holds down the CO2 in the soil. The trees hold down the CO2 in the trees. There's 3 times more, I think it's 3 times more carbon in the soil than all the CO2 we have emitted into the atmosphere with fossil fuels. And what's happening is the soils used to hold that carbon down in the trees. Now the soils are depleted from green revolution farming and then biotech farming and all of that, over fertilizing, over irrigating. It's a mess. And so the carbon's coming up, and the forests are dying from global warming. The carbon's coming up. So here's 3 times more carbon down there in the soil and in the trees than is in the whole atmosphere with climate change with fossil fuels. And it's coming up in the next 30 years. It's coming up already. This is dangerous. There's going to be a huge amount of jobs in stewarding our soil base and our forests and our ecosystem. And this is work that's in our water systems, especially with the droughts, the floods. As you know, it's not just the Yellow River or the Yangtze. The Mississippi River is now drying up. Lake Mead and the Colorado River is drying up. This is happening all over the world. And then we're having the floods, the droughts, the wildfires. We have to prepare a generation to be stewards of nature and to actually build in the resilient infrastructure. Robots cannot do this. It's too complicated. How do you have robots monitor and actually think of ways to replenish, for example, wetlands? I mean, they can't do that. This is so silly. What do you think? A robot can't do that? That's absurd. You have to have human beings doing it, and it's time and error as you move. And it requires millions of people, skilled and unskilled. It requires all sorts of new businesses for ecosystem services, even to lay out the infrastructure for the 3rd industrial revolution. I mean, it takes human beings because the infrastructures are very complicated. And each day you have to make changes. Anyone that's ever worked in a construction site, a big construction site, the plans are always go awry. You have a blueprint, there's plans, and every day you have to get everyone together across the construction site, each doing something different. And they have to figure out what next. The plan changes day by day. Nature is even more complicated. The idea that we have past data for analytics, that robots are going to then, in AI, help us save the planet is childish. There's a role for AI, a role for big data and analytics. I spend a lot of time in the books. But to think that that they can do the job is naive.
Great. So I do have another question. So I work on energy and carbon neutrality. So carbon neutrality has been a very big trend in this, especially in the past 2 or 3 years, and it's going to be very important to decide the global climate change and also a lot of things in the next 30 years. So what do you think that if we envision an energy or carbon neutral future, so what kind of conflicts we may still have? We may avoid some conflicts about fossil fuels, but we may also engage in some other conflicts. So what do you think?
The big question, I'm sorry.
No,
The big question is going to be water. This is the watery planet. Everything depends on water. Water moves the lithosphere, the atmosphere, the biosphere. It's water. The problem is there's going to be a huge struggle around water. The floods, the droughts, the wildfires. This is where we're going. And there's something called the water energy nexus, which most people don't know about. I'm sure you folks do, but it's not commonly known. Even climate journalists don't know it. It takes water to move energy, but it also takes energy to move water. So in other words, water doesn't go through the pipes unless you have electricity to move it. When there's a power breakdown because of a climate disaster or a cyber terrorist attack, there's no water. 72 hours, you're in peril of death. You can go without food for 3 weeks, but not water. But here's what people don't realize. Here we're going with rivers drying up, lakes drying up, dams that are going to be obsolete because of what's happening in the climate. And the water energy nexus tells us that you need water. What you do is you take natural gas or coal and you use that to heat up water. The steam from the water runs the electric turbines for the electricity, all right? So you know how much of the fresh water in my country is used for thermoelectric electricity? Over 40% of all the water we withdraw. It's even larger in some other countries. So here we are with droughts and wildfires, and we're withdrawing 40% of the water just for thermoelectric power plants. There's a big study done in Finland recently of all 12,000 thermoelectric power plants that require heating up water by burning coal or gas. And what they found is if we move to solar and wind, we eliminate 96% of the water. That's it. Don't need it. So why are we still putting natural gas-fired power plants online and coal-fired power plants online? Nuclear power plants are just as bad because they need water to cool the nuclear reactors. But now the ecosystems are so drought-ridden and so heat wave-ridden that the water's too hot. They can't use it to cool the nuclear reactors. In France, in the summer, they have to turn down the nuclear reactors and shut them down because the water's too hot in the rivers to cool the nuclear reactors. People die. Many years ago, 10,000 old people died in one summer alone. And then if they do use the water to cool the nuclear reactor, the water comes back heated, and then it's dehydrating the grape fields and the crops. These are the kinds of interrelated things that we need to take care of because these are things that can be dealt with. But it requires a systemic approach, complex, adaptive, social ecological systems modeling. It requires that our anthropologists talk to our economists, talk to our sociologists, talk to our chemists and physicists, and then a whole generation of kids growing up learn interdisciplinary studies. They learn that all disciplines are part of a single knowledge base, and we have to think much more sophisticated, much more mindful. And we can't do that if we dummy down the children. They got to be out in nature because that's the learning experience. What we find is that as we've moved more and more to the internet and quick anticipation and response, the kids are losing vocabulary because they're dealing with emoticons, short quips, quick excitement. They're losing reflective abilities, the ability to be reflective, the ability to be mindful, the ability to think. And they don't have language anymore. Because if you're just zipping from one 2-minute segment to another to get some kind of excitement out of it, we lose the ability to actually have vocabulary and to think together. Well, there's a good reason to have the digital world, but it's there for our understanding of how we can realize what's going on the planet and build a resilient society. But if the metaverse is a way of life, we're lost. Our kids will be dummied down and not be able to respond. And professors tell me that the young people each year are becoming less systemic. Now, the good news, Taylor Swift, do you know Taylor Swift in China? I'm too old to know her, but I found out. So Taylor Swift, she did something pretty extraordinary. She put out 2 albums last year. She grew up in a rural area. She grew up in nature. I don't think she did it on purpose. And the 2 albums were all about nature, and that's the real freedom. That's the real sense of belonging. That's the real excitement in the world. And the album, the key album, won the Grammy of the Year award. And we also found during COVID, the young people finally, I'm sure it's true in China, they wanted to get out of the house. They couldn't stand it anymore. They had to get out. Japan was the first place to do that because people were dying at the desk in the 1990s, what's called the 24/7 workload. And they just started spontaneously going out for taking a walk in the park or in the forest, and they felt better. This wasn't up here. What happens when you take that little walk is all the biological clocks in your body, you don't know this, they're now readapting to what's going on in the rhythms around them, and it changes your whole metabolism. You don't have to think it. We're starting to see forest schools. Germany has thousands of forest schools. Many countries have them. I don't know if you have them yet, where they take 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds with a guide into nature, rain or shine, no facilities, all outdoors. And these kids love it because they become a little pack, like a little animal pack. And one moment they see butterflies all landing near them. Wow, what's going on? The next moment they see a bird fighting with another bird about a nest. And this so excites them. It's much more exciting than a little pixelized cartoon on a screen. And they're learning from other creatures. They feel alive and they feel their freedom as inclusivity, not exclusivity. They feel themselves part of something and something they can actually talk about, but they're learning how to be mindful and reflective, and they're learning how to be relational. They're learning that they're part of nature. They're learning the old-fashioned doctrines of the Eastern religions harmonize with nature. It's the road to not just a better life, it's the road to happiness. It's the road to happiness.
Thank you. So now we have a few more questions. We have one question from Marky. So the question is, to achieve the vision, the future that you envisioned, it surely requires a paradigm shift from a systematic thinking perspective. We may need a change of value in our economic, political, and even the social system. What are the resources there that can drive these internal and mental changes? Can education alone do that?
It's parenting and education. There's no other way around it. It's going to be education, but from the get-go, all the way from the time the parents are the first educators. And it's always about learning as an empathic experience. Learning as an empathic experience, not as a rational, detached, objective experience, but as an empathic experience, a relational experience. And so when the Eastern religions and philosophies talk about a relational self, they're right, but that has to be an empathic self as well. And I think it's going to be up to educators starting all the way from the time children are 4 and 5, and parents before that. So I do think it's in the cultural DNA of the East. It may have gotten lost a little bit in recent century, but it's still there. In the West, we certainly have the Romantic tradition, which is helpful for us. I don't think it's a simple task. I think the educators need to move, and the scientific community is moving now. The educators need to move. The technicians are there, the engineers are there, and then finally, we need a responsive governance at the bioregional level. As I said before, climate change doesn't care about your political boundaries. We're still going to have those boundaries, but we have to cross those boundaries and work in common ecosystems. Now, China has been, I mentioned Cascadia, right, earlier, and the Great Lakes. China has now created the second one, the eight ecoregions of China last year. The ecology ministry, with 16 other ministries underneath it, have created eight ecoregions. So thank you. Other countries have to follow. The US has done it, China's done it. We haven't done it in Europe yet. That's education in and of itself.
Thank you. So the next question is about, I guess, how difficult, how to make it realized. And the question is from Zhang Yi. It said that the value change is very difficult, and he's worried that it may not happen in time. It may take another 2 to 3 extreme summers like that in 2022 for the general society to realize that the business usual model is very absurd. So then, you will still have all the established upper structures that will oppose the change. So how do you think that is? Do we have enough time to make things happen? And to
well, time is short. Time is short. This is a real tough struggle at this point in time for our species. What I see day by day is that we just get bogged down in the old geopolitical world. And somehow this is so frightening what's going on. I know people just don't want to talk about it. I'm sure that you don't see much conversation about it. Parents don't want to hear about it. Grandparents don't want to hear about it. There weren't an extinction event. I can understand that. And then we need a new generation, not only of academics and scientists, we need a new generation in the political arena who will lay out what's happening and understand we're the most adaptive species. And if we so desire, we can come together as a family. This can be done. We are the most adaptive species, but it requires a completely new way of thinking. Instead of it's each against the other, it's a war of competition, it's winners and losers. In networks don't work by zero-sum games. The more people in the network, the more everyone benefits from the network. The more people engage in open source sharing of knowledge, the more everyone benefits by everybody's contribution. Everything I'm saying is common sense. This isn't some intellectual odyssey. This is just common sense. It's almost embarrassingly so, really. It takes will. And I do think the Gen Zs now need to, the young generation has to want to make the change, but I really do believe it's going to be the teachers. It's going to be the teachers. Now, there are interdisciplinary universities now. You know, there are many universities, as you know, in China and elsewhere that are starting to do interdisciplinary seminars, but you need the whole university to become interdisciplinary. That means breaking down the departments and all the little power and all that. There are some. Sapienza University has just announced in Italy, one of the oldest and the largest university in Europe. A friend of mine has just put together 100 professors, 1,400 students, all interdisciplinary. There's Sabancı University in Turkey. There's the Israeli university that a friend of mine founded. They're interdisciplinary. And then there are many universities that have interdisciplinary courses now. We're on the right track, but we have to start it in grade school, right? And even before that.
Well, so because quite a lot of us here are professors in universities, do you have any specific suggestions for us? So how can we do interdisciplinary studies to make this one happen, to help this?
Well, you know, I could connect you, if you like, I could connect you to Sapienza University, Livio De Santoli. He's the what you would call the proctor, the director, number 2. He's the one that put the solar panels on the Vatican. He's a great guy. We've worked together for years, and he's done it in the last 2 years. And maybe we could put you together with Sabancı University in Turkey, the Israeli University. Jerry Wynn, who's a colleague of mine at Wharton, created that university with another guy. We have the Lauder Institute at Wharton. We could put a bunch of the folks together. If you want to do something similar with some professors from various universities and have a few virtual conferences and to see about how this could start to happen.
Great, thank you very much.
There are, if you go up on Google for a search, I looked it up, interdisciplinary studies, and there are several hundred that have specific courses where you can get a joint degree. You can get a degree in 2 or 3 topics. They haven't made the whole thing interdisciplinary, but the Catholic University of Lille has done this in France. My global team did the 10 years of deployment there. It's the industrial region of France. It's the region of Macron and Marie Le Pen, opposites on the political ladder. But when we deployed, we don't do it. We just come in and all the talent there, the scientists, the professors, the teachers. They took 26 universities and put them together and 250 high schools. The Catholic University of Lille led. First of all, they turned the whole school into solar, wind, zero emission. Then all teachers have to teach interdisciplinary. And then all students have to be in teams, like you do in graduate school. So the professor still has to be there, but each of the teams the individuals have to teach each other. And they haven't eliminated grades yet, but you really succeed or fail based on your team. Knowledge is not power, knowledge is relationship. All right. And then they have to have clinical learning. So whatever you learn in the classroom, you have to go out in the community and work with what the community knows, because they've got a lot of skills. In America, we have service learning. We just didn't put the interdisciplinary together at the school level. In other words, millions of our kids, I don't know if you know this, from 13 years on, they have to be in the community as part of their curriculum and serve in a nonprofit or civil society organization, a food kitchen, or cleaning up the local ecosystem, whatever. This has been doing that for years. You don't have that yet, I don't think, China. I'm not sure. Maybe you do.
We do it in Hong Kong.
In Hong Kong, yes.
All right. Good
In
for
Hong
you.
Kong, our kids have to do it. So they have all kinds of activities.
Good for you.
But
But why don't we get the universities together? I've been having this conversation with other professors recently. We could have a preliminary conversation, maybe with Jerry Wind at Wharton, DeSantoli at Sapienza, Savanchi, and maybe Catholic University of Lille, some of you folks, and who knows? That's how things start.
Yes, that'd be great. Thank you very much, Jeremy. So now we have come out of run out of time. So we're really great honor to have you to talk to us today, and also we are also honored to have Professor En and Professor Bu to give us a very wonderful discussion point. Let me express our gratitude representing all the three organizers: PACE, Professional Association for Chinese Environment, and also CUHK's Center for Urban Innovation. And also we have Dr. Li Yong's so the Return Scholars Association. Thank all of you for the organizing efforts, and thank you very much, Jeremy, for giving us the honor.
Well, thank you very much for allowing me to spend some time with you, and I hope this is just the beginning of a very rich conversation that can carry forward
Indeed.
with all of us.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you.
My
a
pleasure.
lot.
It was a great honor to be with you. Bye.
Same
Bye-bye.
here, yes.
Thanks.